We need to be honest about our nation's history, which is to say that we've always been a divided nation. If we're going to be able to strengthen and maximize the full power and potential of our nation, what is that nation that we want to move towards? One dedicated to the proposition of equality.
That's the clear, fresh vision that our guest today writes about in his recent article in The Nation, an article that put into writing what we'd been thinking about, which is to say this. We are pretty tired of the barrage of viewpoints standing against what the Trump administration is doing to our country, the authoritarianism, the oppression, the broligarchy. We believe it is much more powerful to, round out those views to include not just what we don't want, but, and perhaps even more importantly, what are we fighting for? What are we aspiring to be?
And we would argue it's the proposition of equality, of well-being for all. I mean, this is something we firmly stand behind. And to share his perspectives, we bring you the incomparable Steve Phillips with some of his latest thoughts since the inauguration of number 47. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multiracial best friends, Sarah and me, Sasha.
So, if one thing comes to mind when we think about you, it's that you remain really unwavering in your ability to provide both hope and perspective in dark times, which is, I would classify this as dark times right now. So can you share with us a little about the latest article that we read of yours from The Nation, sort of the articulation of country versus nation and why it's really so important to face our history so that we can stand up and fight for what we want?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and happy to be back with you guys. Let me even just start this with a real quick story. And so I've been getting a lot more into art these past couple years. And I have this painting now in my living room by John Biggers. And it's of a sharecropper, a person bending over, picking cotton. It very, dramatizes that individual act of picking some cotton. And the reason I have that is because I was in a conversation with Jesse Jackson back in 1989. We brought him out to California for this march on Sacramento, and people were talking about, says, Jesse, you must be so tired. You're flying back and forth across the country, and you're working so hard around the clock. And without missing a beat, Jesse says, it beats picking cotton. And I just really thought that so simply distilled contextually the looking at a current challenge or difficulty in the context of where we've been in this country. So that I think is sustaining me in this moment. And then what I was trying to lay out in this piece, and I think it's important from a strategic standpoint, also frankly from a mental and emotional health standpoint, right? So we lost the federal election. There's a great deal of, dismay and justified alarm, but there's a sense that nobody supports us and everyone's fled our support and our side, and we have to figure out as we wander in the wilderness. And so what I was trying to illuminate is really what I had, spent my whole previous book talking about, is that, well, I talk about the Civil War never ended, but I think what this election shows is also that we've always had two nations in this one country. And it was clearest and most stark during the Civil War, obviously, when you had the southern states, seceded from the Union, formed their own country, formed their own nation, their own government, and went to war to defend white supremacy and slavery. And then we had the Union. And so we had two distinct nations who were literally at war with each other at that time. And so what I was trying to illustrate is that continues to go on, and that continues to drive our politics today. The core, I think I put it at 38% of Trump's vote comes from the slave states, the Confederate states, in terms of the cornerstone of the current Republican political power within the country. So there's that, I think, important understanding where we're at. But also, I think another important part of this is that the concept of a nation is not just a geographic boundaries in its shared identity, values, vision, and culture. And that's clearly what, we see manifesting itself on Trump's side. But if we start to think that way, then it gives more of a roadmap, and I think gives more kind of hope and possibility, is that even in these states that we lost, such as Texas, Harris County, Texas, where Houston is, we won. And so Harris County, Texas is larger than 15 states in this country. And so within that larger state, we have that. And then you take Harris and Dallas and where Austin is and all these other places. For one, we can still do a lot in those places in terms of the local elected officials advancing a public policy agenda that's around justice and equality, but also those are the places that are going to provide the path back to power, is the non-voting people, progressive people in those places. That's the path to ultimately flipping those states and then taking back control of the country overall.
I appreciate that. I feel like you segued into the question I want to ask because you started talking a little bit about structure and strategy. And in our previous conversation, which listeners will get a chance to hear in a moment, you highlighted for us some incredible level 5 leaders and organizations that we should be getting behind. You know, a lot of the conversations Misasha and I have been having recently are saying you don't have to recreate the wheel. You don't have to start a new organization to make a difference. What you actually can do with your tremendous amount of power and privilege is get behind people, incredible people who are already doing the work. That said, a lot has happened over the last 2.5 years since we last connected. What's changed in the landscape? And are there any other causes or organizations or people you believe in now?
Well, the work continues and people, come forward and then, people, make the transition out. But I think the fundamental principles endure. I think one place that I haven't maybe emphasized as much really is North Carolina. And the North Carolina, I think, is going to be critical battleground in the coming years in a number of different levels, right? So, and it's also critical to realize, just in terms of people's misunderstanding of what happened in 2024, because the dominant narrative is that, all these people defected from the Democrats to go back Trump, and they were dissatisfied with, pick your source of dissatisfaction, the price of eggs, the too radical LGBTQ agenda, too loose on the border, none of which were actually factually true, even if that, were something to be advisable. But it's important to remember that in Georgia and North Carolina, and also in Wisconsin and Nevada, Kamala got more votes than Joe Biden got 4 years earlier. So there was not a mass defection of Democratic voters. There was a bigger increase in previously non-voting Republicans coming out than there was an increase in Democrats. So that really should give us some guidance. So I say that to say that North Carolina is going to be very important going forward, and very important on a number of different levels. First of all, it remains a very closely contested state. It's a state that Obama won in 2008. And I was just looking today at the 2026 Senate map and the North Carolina Senate race, Senator Tom Tillis, Republican there. That's one of the best chances Democrats have to pick up a Senate seat. And so it's very closely decided in prior elections, et cetera. So it's important on that level and then heading towards 28 in terms of being able to flip the landscape. So as a state, I think that deserves probably more attention than it has been getting. There's groups such as Carolina Federation, which are doing great work around similar to the work that I illustrate for the other states in How We Win the Civil War, the strong civic engagement organizations that are rooted in the communities, doing the disciplined work around registering and mobilizing voters. That's an organization and a set of leaders that I think deserve more time, attention, and support in the coming period.
I think that's really helpful because I think what I have heard the most, I guess, between Election Day and now, and increasingly since the inauguration, is people sort of in this state of shock or surprise, or I don't know, over hyper normalizing what's happening, and then sort of ending up with this ultimate question of what can I do, or what should I do, or how should I think about this? And, besides sort of the larger statewide or thinking about individual states and strategizing there, what else do you think would be most helpful at this juncture, right, for people to be doing? And, our podcast is called Dear White Women. So white women, white people in particular, to get out of this sort of stage of, I don't know where to start, and think about how can I affect change?
Yeah, well, I would say two things in that regard. I don't know if we had talked before, but about the group Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is specifically created, and their whole work is about helping white people in general, and really largely white women, be stronger, more effective fighters for racial justice. And so SURJ is a national organization, it's a few 100,000 members, chapters across the country, online presence, and they do excellent work in terms of trying to help connect people and give direction and guidance in a more specific way. So that was one specific suggestion. And then two is I've been talking about this concept more. I'm probably going to try to flesh out even more, but about we need 1 million precinct captains in this country. And so one of the things about electoral work and political work that sadly, well, I don't think that, I was going to say political consultants don't understand. They understand, it's just too much work. And so in our most recent podcast with Tram Wynn out of Virginia, we're talking about how hard it is to actually organize canvassing and door-to-door work and contacting voters. And it's very labor intensive, and Tram has had these detailed spreadsheets that where do you meet? Where exactly does your grouping meet to start to go do the precinct walk? And then you have to generate the list, hand out lists to everybody, collect that data back in. So it's very labor intensive and frankly not that lucrative as much as, sitting at your computer and designing digital TV ads that you take a commission on, which is how most consultants function. So it's a long way of saying that I feel that we need to be focusing on this concept around maximizing the progressive vote. And that's what the right is, and that's why we lost, is that they brought out more people. And so it's a very granular, person-to-person, neighborhood-to-neighborhood type of endeavor. And so that's why I'm liking this concept of 1 million precinct captains. And so the advantage of this, of the electoral work, is you can get the list. So a precinct's around 1,000 people, and that many of those people vote regularly, so they don't need as much contact. But you can actually get that information. And I was just thinking today is that people can become a local precinct captain. They can contact 5 people a day, do that over a course of, many different weeks to get towards, and then you could do a newsletter, like an old school dead tree newsletter about progressive issues. It's also about highlighting how, anti-people and pro-inequality and pro-injustice the current administration is, and hand that out to your neighbors every couple weeks on a regular basis. And so it's that level of granular person-to-person organizing and communication that I think is going to be necessary writ large, and then in particular there's probably about in 10 to 15 congressional districts that we really should win and should have won, and actually that Joe Biden got the most votes in 2020 in these congressional districts. So we have to make sure every single potential voter in those congressional districts is contacted, organized, encouraged to vote, gotten out to vote. And if that takes place, we really should be able to take back the House in 2026. And so that'll be a significant break upon, the rush to making America white again that we have coming out of the White House right now. So that's, I think, another particular piece is to start to orient yourself. Then even also people can create your own little listserv. Who are 10 to 20 people that should get regular information and updates, and then you could email them every a couple of weeks, keeping them in the loop. A very old school precinct level communication, organizing, mobilization operation, I think, is what's called for, and I also think it's going to be the path back to power for us.
I think that is very powerful, and it requires people who are leading these precincts in particular for talking to the white women to speak up and use their voice and do something different that might make them feel a little bit uncomfortable, because that means you're sticking your neck out for something. And one of the things we talk about, this episode is entitled "The United States Should Focus on Equality." I think it's very important for people to reorient what they're saying from not anti-Trump to what are we building? And I think a lot of your article also focuses on that. We need to be focused on, we stand for equality. How would you articulate what it is that we are looking for, and the policies in particular that we're looking to put in place by electing leaders who care about humanity, for example?
Right. And I think it's even more important to do that in the context also of all these attacks on, DEI and affirmative action and all of this, in that all of that, and, obviously it's very mean-spirited, is even the right word, but it's, very ill-intentioned. But even with all of what they're doing, those are all remedies, and they're just remedies. And they're remedies to trying to deal with inequality. And so we could conceptually even concede, let's not even talk about DEI or affirmative action or any of that stuff. But the underlying problem remains. And do we care about that problem? Or are we going to do something about the problem? So that's what I think people have to be engaging into their conversations with their family and their friends and their neighbors is, do we care about this equality? And I do lay that out in that nation piece and it's been funny going back and looking at these docs, because we kind of know these things, but then we don't look at them as deeply or from a current lens. So the Gettysburg Address by Lincoln is a very good speech, right? And he defines the two nations within this country. And he talks about conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal. So are we still dedicated to that? That's the initial conversation. There are very few people who will say no, right? But then when you get to this next stuff, and then we kind of get to this. But I think we have to get people back to that level of, do we care about the rampant, widespread inequality in this country? And then if so, what are we going to do about it? And that is also where this is really the, it's the necessity, but also the opportunity for, Trump's attacking all these different remedies around inequality. So he revokes Lyndon Johnson's executive order from 1965 that talked about federal government has to combat discrimination, et cetera. I was thinking about that this morning. I was like, we don't have equality yet. So clearly that executive order had not fully accomplished what we wanted it to accomplish. So this is the chance then to revisit that proposition, is that what should we be doing? And how do we move forward in this regard? And what is the right measures, the right approaches and programs for this period? And by this period, I was doing the math this morning, this as well, we're really talking about the rest of this century. It was 60 years ago that LBJ signed this executive order. And it has endured for 60 years. And so what we have to develop now for this next period is really for the next 60 years, which takes us almost through the rest of the century. So there's all of that. And then I think it's another substantive point that I think people should be lifting up. And I think we need to shift our thinking in terms of how we're going after talking about these issues. Because we've talked for a long time about inequality in terms of, why aren't there more people of color? Why aren't there more women? Why do we have these shortfalls in terms of the number of people who are there? If we switch the conversation to, why are there so many white people being hired? Why are there so many white people getting all these contracts? Why is there white overrepresentation instead of people of color and female underrepresentation? It leads you in a different direction. Not like, what are these other people lacking, and how do we get them more education and more support? You then have to turn your attention to the embedded and empirically proven, but very much ignored, looking at the embedded, often unconscious bias towards white people. And so we've had 47 presidents in this country. Now, only one's been a person of color. Our picture of what a leader looks like is pretty clear. You see it, very much in Hollywood, and who gets the leading, actor, actress roles and whatnot, that we have very deeply embedded pro-white and pro-male bias that influences everything from contracting to hiring to promoting. And so if we turn our attention on that, I actually think that'll be much more productive in terms of getting towards addressing inequality than just looking at what are people of color and women lacking.
Love the reframe. Love the power behind that and the intentionality of it. Is there anything else that we haven't asked that you think is important to discuss at this point?
Well, it gets back to this point about the composition of these two nations. I'm working on a part 2 for that piece that I ran in The Nation. So one of these is I think it's in terms of feeling more, understanding and owning more of our power. And because right now, I think everybody feels very powerless and dispirited and discouraged. Well, first, just on a financial level, the states that have Democratic governors in this country provide more money to the federal government and to the operation of this country and to the economic productivity of this country than the states that don't. So from that standpoint, our nation is more economically robust and powerful. And then the other piece of this was getting back to power, right? I was talking about Texas earlier, right? And so Texas elections are decided anywhere from 600,000 to 1 million plus votes. There are 4 million non-voting people of color in Texas. In Texas as a state, it's 49% people of color in terms of its eligible voter population. So focusing in particularly on the key counties in key states that are part of our nation is a way back to manifesting and translating our population majority into an electoral majority. And it really, I think, it's to still feel and know and understand that we continue to have majority support for our agenda if we will articulate it and fight for it and then organize people to mobilize and get behind it.
Incredible. Thank you so much for agreeing to come back on and chat with us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for asking. Glad to be here. I'm Steve Phillips, the author of How We Win the Civil War. It's my second book after writing Brown is the New White, and I'm the founder of Democracy in Color, which is a multiracial political media organization.
So I thank you very much for writing your book, How We Win the Civil War. To lay a little groundwork, you set up your book so that the reader understands the foundation that we're built on today, which is that the Civil War never really ended, as in, we never really fully uprooted the notion that this country was built by and for rich white men. And I'll quote this part, but it's the clearest proof that the South never surrendered is that they continued to wage a violent and bloody civil war long after the cessation of armed hostilities.
Yes. Well, let me just jump in for a second. I'm the granddaughter of a Civil War historian. Wow. And so from my perspective, I've always thought, sort of what came out of Reconstruction, sort of the black codes, the policing of black bodies, as sort of a direct line from anti-black laws from that period to Trayvon Martin, to George Floyd, to everything that's happening today. So I'm so excited to talk to someone else who not only firmly believes this to be true, but really lays out the support for that. But this is still, I think, a hugely controversial or a difficult idea for a lot of people. So what sort of pushback have you gotten, to this book, and in particular to this part of your thesis?
Well, yeah, it's a difficult concept for people to grasp. A lot of the things that we're grappling, the Justice Department itself was created to deal with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. The oath of office that every member of Congress takes to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The domestic part is the Confederates, that they didn't want sneaking back into the government. And so we still say that, today. And then one of the things that was so fascinating writing the book is because originally it started out as a theoretical concept. The publisher, New Press, came to me and said, "Do you want to write a second book?" And I was like, "Yeah, maybe we should use the Civil War as a metaphor for what this current political moment is." And then 8 months later, people carrying the Confederate flag, wearing sweatshirts saying MAGA Civil War, January 6, 2021, stormed the Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power. It's like, well, it's not so theoretical anymore. And then when I began to get into the history and telling the story, everybody obviously knows Lincoln was assassinated. I didn't even know exactly when and exactly why. So the surrender at Appomattox of the Confederates to end the Civil War took place on the Sunday. That Tuesday, Lincoln gives a speech talking about limited voting rights for African Americans. John Wilkes Booth is there, hears the speech, tells somebody that means N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever give. And then Friday of that week, sneaks into Ford Theater and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. So that's not surrendering. Right? And so you just take that, and then what that resulted in was Andrew Johnson being ascended to the presidency, who was very sympathetic and supportive of the Confederates, opposed the 15th Amendment, opposed the Civil Rights War amendments. And then you have 1876, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. The North gave the South back to the slaveholders. And so then for 100 years after that, we had legalized racial segregation, legalized white supremacy within this country. In that, I didn't realize when I wrote my first book that everybody thinks, Brown versus Board of Education, and it eliminated legalized segregation. It only eliminated racial segregation in education, and that was 54. So it was completely legal all the way up to 1964 to racially discriminate in housing, in hiring. And so all of the different racial inequality, racial wealth gap we have was government sanctioned. On top of which they take the GI Bill, where you basically gave billions of dollars to white people. And so there's a very clear through line. So if you want to say anything ended, you could only really say it ended in 64 or 65. And then we can debate what that past 50 years has actually been looked like. But when I started to make the case, I was like, oh, it's true. We have, in fact, they never stopped fighting. We have, in fact, been engaged in this war all the way since the 1860s.
We're still fighting white supremacy. And so the second half of your book, is the great outline of the points that we need to win this civil war. To summarize, it's the level 5 leaders, it's the strong civic organizations, data-driven plans, and playing the long game. And you review successes, right? Unexpected successes in states like Georgia, Virginia, Arizona, smaller enclaves like San Diego and Houston. And that's the point of hope. When we think about winning the war, what percentage of it is really just political control and shaping the rules, and how much work is required to teach like individual hearts and minds. So many people personalize racism and work towards anti-racism to uprooting individual beliefs to realize that all humans are humans and worth giving equal rights to. Like, how do you approach those two buckets?
Well, I fundamentally focused on the control of our society, which is elections and government and public policies. And so Martin Luther King used to talk about you can't legislate attitudes, but you can legislate behavior. And I used to joke to friends of mine that, I don't care if you call me the N-word if I have my 40 acres and a mule, right? And so that fundamentally, I think, is the major point. And I think that the attitudinal, the hearts and minds piece, I also think flows from getting into positions of power. I don't know if you remember, there was this, when Obama was president, he was speaking at, I think it was in Ohio at a school, and then I don't know how this came up, but in the Q&A, there's a Q&A, that's what it is. The guy stands up and says, my daughter missed school to be here today. It was a white guy. And then Obama's like, goes, oh no, does she need a note? And so he wrote this note, says, please excuse her absence from school today. She was with me, Barack Obama. And then it was on the local news, et cetera. I think that it's things like that change people's perception, and in terms of reducing the fear and raising the acceptance. I mean, I really believe that. So, my friends always joke that no conversation goes by without mentioning Jesse Jackson, which was my formative political experience in the Rainbow Coalition. Jesse Jackson ran for president in 84 and 88. In 89, Virginia elected its first governor, Doug Wilder. New York elected David Dinkins mayor. I really believe that having to confront the prospect of a President Jackson changed the psychology to make it more acceptable for people to think, oh, well, we could have a black governor. And so I think it's some of those things are some of the interplay, but I think it's a outgrowth of the political power piece will get the hearts and minds results. So getting a person like Stacey Abrams to be as influential and prominent as she is, will do more to get acceptance of people who don't look the traditional white male leadership norm, to say, oh, a leader, a brilliant person, a strategist could be somebody who's a dark-skinned, natural-haired, not super thin black woman. And so that in practice, I think, gets at those other pieces. But the fundamental point is we got to get people into positions of power. We have to win these positions and then reorient what public policies flow from that. Now, I think Georgia is the flashpoint of a lot of this, for one, having, been a fundamental state in the Confederacy and this whole country's history, place, slavery was held, where Margaret Mitchell, the author of Gone with the Wind, is from. So it has this Gone with the Wind is set in Georgia, right? So it has this very fundamental place within our society, and the birthplace of Martin Luther King. And so it's not, not inconsequential is too not strong a word, if that makes any sense at all, is that it's very fundamental to this country's arc and trajectory, that you have the man who is literally standing in the shoes of the pulpit of Martin Luther King Jr., running for and elected and serving in the United States Senate off of this work within Georgia. So it really shows what is possible and then what the transformative implications of that are. So anything good that has happened in the past 2 years out of the United States Congress is because of the work in Georgia and the election of Warnock and also Ossoff. And so that shows the transformative and systemic reach and influence. When you care about climate change and you think there's anything good in the climate bill that passed, that goes back to Georgia and Warnock. And so that's substantively and symbolically reflective of what winning in those places actually do. But it's not easy, is the other piece. And is that Warnock spent $90 million and barely won. And so the opposition is ferocious. The voter suppression is extensive. And all of the other systemic institutional forces weigh against it. And I do try to talk in the book about, it's not accidental that we've never had a black woman governor. It's not because there haven't been smart black women. It's because there's all of the different institutional as well as psychological barriers around what leadership looks like. So the mountain is very, very, very steep, but that's also why it's so significant if we're able to scale it in a place like Georgia. And then that can hopefully then give, well, and it will. I think we're on the course towards it, but that's why I want to accelerate is why I wrote this book, is that what people don't appreciate is that Texas demographically and statistically is actually more promising than Georgia. Is that we lose in Texas, like Biden lost by like 600,000 votes. There's 4 million people of color who didn't vote. And so that's pretty easy math if you can focus on it in terms of being able to get those folks actually out to vote. Texas is 38% white in terms of its state. The majority of people are Black and Latino in Texas. So all of that is before us if we can see it, lean into it, invest in it, and prioritize it. So that's the purpose really why I'm trying to get through with this book.
Part of the steps, you talk about having detailed plans to how do you engage voters of color who've historically been oppressed and where systems make it hard for them to get engaged in voting. But can we talk a little bit then about the story of the Montgomery Women's Political Council? Because I think you point out in the book, and I think it's true, people think that Rosa Parks gave up her seat and there was a boycott and it was successful, not realizing the length of the boycott, not realizing the extent to which planning went into it. Can you talk a little bit about all the planning behind what made the bus boycott a success? Because I think we can then extrapolate onto some of these other things about voter engagement too.
Yeah, that was very interesting to learn about and to try to share. And I also try to reference it in one of my muses through the whole book was Isabel Wilkerson and her book Caste, and which I just found to be amazing work, but also in terms of the analogies and things that she references. And so she talks in there about we are all actors on a stage that was set long before we arrived, and that the roles are reserved for, we know who is center stage, who is sidekick, who is in the chorus, etc. And so in this country, we've had 46 presidents, all of them men, 45 of them white men. So the role of president is reserved in this country basically for a white man, which is how we've proceeded. Well, I would argue that the role of data geek is seen as a young white guy who's fairly fluent with computers or whatnot. And that is what then led me to the piece where the role of data geek is not a Black woman in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s before they even had personal computers. And I actually I talked about this in a speech I had given. It's like, imagine you had to organize a carpool for 10 people. And so you'd have to think about it. You can't all fit in one car. And so it's like, how many people, where they need to go? What time do you have to pick people up? And so you have to start thinking about that logistically. How do you organize that? And then it's like, well, imagine you had to organize a carpool for your entire block. That's a whole other thing. Where's everybody going? Where do how do you do that? Now imagine it for 50,000 people. And that's what the Montgomery bus boycott was. And so that's what they talked, the Women's Association there talks about how they had calculated it all out. And they were like, we need 54,000 flyers. So that's this many reams of paper that we will then cut into thirds. And then we will hand out all across the city to tell people when exactly it started and where to go. And then there's the whole piece around the transportation system. Where do you go? And so if you're going to have a carpool, where do you get picked up? What time do you have to be there? And they had coordinated all of this out. And they had multiple pickup points and pickup times that people would go through, and then where you would go to fill up for gas. It's a remarkable organizing and data and extraordinarily sophisticated operation that is completely lost to history, right? The narrative is Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat, and then the next day we had, freedom. The bus boycott went on for an entire year. So 365 days of this. And so that also gets, this point around long game tenacity, et cetera. So there are lots of examples of this in terms of expertise and sophistication that don't get valued or appreciated. And they don't get valued or appreciated because they don't fit the mold of who we think experts and, geniuses are.
It's so true. And the way, when we think about it, the way that you described it, I hope everyone listening can sort of imagine, when we talk about sacrifice, when you talk about doing something different, it's not glamorous stuff that you post on social media. It is a day-to-day change in behavior. It is cutting flyers into thirds. It's doing the actual little things that lead to big change, with tenacity, with organization, with all the things that you talk about. And you just talked about that long game. I think that is also important in a country that we're in right now. We tend to operate in these 4-year cycles. And it's like we move in this direction, then we move in this direction. And we're constantly doing this back and forth. But I think about China and the long game that they have always historically played. And that's something that we have talked about a bit. So when you mentioned the presidential election of 1876, where they brokered the trade to give control back to the South, the Rutherford B. Hayes win, and then that sort of stuff. How, I guess, is it important to think about the long game?
I want to add too, because I think we've recently seen the long game come through in a very different format with the Dobbs decision, right? And 50 years of really strong organizing sort of by evangelicals and Republican Party in certain ways, really bound together first over segregation and wanting to hold on to segregation. And they were like, wait, we need a topic that's going to bind us all together. Let's do abortion. But you saw that very organized long game over 50 years to get from Roe to Dobbs. And so, I would love to hear more about that and why this, because to Sarah's point, we have such a short-term memory in this country. And I think we see Dobbs and we're like, oh no, this is throw up our hands and we need to change it back immediately. But that's not how this really works.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Dobbs is the most recent and painful example of their long game. The attacks on the voting rights are another example, right? The New York Times had a piece about there's been a 50-year assault upon the Voting Rights Act ever since it was first created. And they've had this, perspective around staying in the game, funding the different parts of it. So John Roberts, Supreme Court Justice John Roberts, got his start in the Justice Department under Reagan in the 80s, trying to eviscerate the Voting Rights Act. And so it's stayed at it all these different, points in time. So that's also partly another example is can you find the people who are going to be at it for the long term and back them? And so that's one of the core messages I lay out in the book, because I talk about this concept of level 5 leaders, people who are very self-effacing, but very driven, disciplined, organized, and effective, and tenacious. So every single one of the places, the case studies that I lay out in the book, have the same leadership core has been at it for a decade. And they have methodically and meticulously continued and steadily built, and they continuously increase their power and their influence. And that's not to say how people think about it, but there are people who are oriented that way and are willing and committed to doing that. And so part of the work is to find those people and back those people. And so that we were talking before we got started, right, in terms of, my wife's situation and her having cancer and us reflecting back on our own, lives and what we have done has had an impact. And what we've both felt, my wife was, said we had this whole thing about what brings you joy. She says, knowing that Stacey Abrams is out in the world brings me joy. And among the most meaningful work that we have done was partnering and supporting Stacey 10 years ago. And so that work from 2012 and sticking with her through the ups and downs and helping her to continue to expand the influence and the impact, resulting in flipping the entire United States Congress, moving trillions of dollars to the American people, passing this defense climate legislation, that's tied to finding someone who was in it for the long game and had those characteristics. And I do think that that's something that individuals can do, is that you don't have to have a massive platform, et cetera. You can find these leaders and support them in ways big and small. Tell your friends about them, and you can, invite them to speak to different groupings that you're connected to, and start to build the kind of called cocktail party cachet about, so-and-so is, a genius. But there's lots of leaders who are like that. So many of the people who I lay out in the book, Michelle Tremillo in Texas, and Tram Nguyen in Virginia, and Andrea Guerrero in San Diego, people like that. So,
I mean, that was a perfect transition, because what I wanted to ask you next was about this idea of let's get tangible here, right? You mentioned the people in the book, but I think just to set the stage a little, you talk about the silent sanctioning of white domestic terrorism, and then even explicit sanctioning. In the case, I had no idea, this 2018 Mississippi State Senator, Cindy Hyde-Smith, talking about her friendship with a cattle rancher and being like, if he invited me to a public hanging, I'd be in the front row. As if it's entertainment. Are you kidding? And so not only did that section force me to really sit and imagine the terror of people talking like this, and also people actually being intimidated into not voting like this, which is what the public hangings were for. But it's really clear, based on the fact that was 2018, I mean, it's only gotten louder and more explicit, the explicit and silent sanctioning of white terrorism, of white supremacy is continuing. So if there's one area that you'd like more white people to speak up against and about to make the most impact, what would that be?
I do think one of the things that's most present in the conversation now is this whole, nonsense of CRT and critical race theory, and that it's simply the latest attempt to whitewash history. And so the traditional progressive response has been to say, oh, no, it's not actually being taught, et cetera, et cetera. But what we need to do is to call it out and to say that, no, these people who are attacking CRT, who are banning books, are trying to literally whitewash history. And we need more people and more white people, frankly, to speak up and say, no, we have to squarely face the actual history of this country, because so much of that is what shapes the current reality that we're in. The racial wealth gap was created and maintained by public policy within this country. And so the failure to study that in this effort to advance this whole book banning and the CRT attacks, et cetera, is a very pernicious and dangerous reality. And there's insufficient voices speaking up about it, and there are insufficient voices speaking up about it on the merits in saying that, no, we actually do need to understand the role that white people have played in this country, the role, how much this country's battle has been about establishing and maintaining the country as a white country. I mean, it was the literal definition of citizenship. You had to be a free white person. From 1790 up to the 1950s, that was the law within this country, upheld by the Supreme Court. They were saying to these Asians in the 1920s who wanted to become part of the country, no, you can't become part of the country because you're not white. That's what the law says. So we need white people to speak up on this issue. And so I would say that's one of the most current things in terms of what's happening in the ongoing. And I guess also is all these attacks on crime.
I love that you said both CRT and crime, because those are two topics that we've talked a lot about on this podcast and that I personally feel very strongly about. So I think we've also talked about how the voices, who are really loud and sort of have this concept of CRT, which is not actually what CRT is. They're very loud and they've been playing the long game for a really long time. They're now getting elected to school boards. And those are the local elections that people sometimes forget to focus on because we're so focused on, a national election or the president, a sort of role. But, along those lines, right, when people are thinking about what they can do, and June Jordan talks about not wanting to be independent, and you mentioned earlier, finding those level 5 leaders, to support, because it doesn't have to be you out there. It can be you supporting this leader for the long game, right? So what are the organizations and people in this country that you see as those key sort of levers for change? And of course, Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight is up there, but where else should we be giving our support?
So starting with the places that are in the book, where there's 5 case studies that lift up level 5 leaders in key organizations. So Virginia, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, and San Diego. So people can see those in those. So, Tram Nguyen and New Virginia Majority, Michelle Tremillo in Texas, the Texas Organizing Project, Montse Redondo with One Arizona in Arizona, the organization Lucha in Arizona, and Andrea Guerrero and Alliance San Diego. So those are key. Those are the hallmark places that I focus on. There are other places that haven't yet had the wins, but are on the cusp or could, and particularly because of the demographic revolution putting them at a tipping point. So particularly Florida and North Carolina. And in Florida in particular, they're somewhat further along in the developmental process. So Andrea Mercado is in Florida, and there's a organization, Florida New Majority, and they call it Florida Rising now, actually. They changed their name this year. They're doing a lot of the same work that is happening, that civic engagement work that's taking places in these other states. And so that's a key place. And people continue to underappreciate the potential of Florida, which is another place that was like super, super closely decided, and still lots of people of color who aren't voting. And so that could actually flip. And Florida is very much more in play than people appreciate and realize. So those are some of the places I think that I would highlight and direct people towards.
That's good to know about Florida, because I had just about given up all hope there too. But it's really good to know that there are, especially, I do see a lot more demographic shift happening in that state. A lot of people from the Northeast are moving down there. So, that is another place that constantly makes headlines and makes you want to cry. But That's good to know. Then I'm gonna look for them as well.
Oh no, I mean, Andrew Gillum lost that race by DeSantis won by like less than 1%, like 30,000 votes out of like 10 million people. And people can say, well, we keep losing by a close amount. The Democratic vote in Florida gubernatorial almost doubled between 2014 and 2018. And so that's not a lack of progress. You have to see that as progress and then keep going and keep building on it. And so that's I sort of distinctly remember the conversation I had with Stacey Abrams in 2018 after she decided to, well, not concede, but to acknowledge that she wasn't going to be governor. And I was like, well, we just keep going. We keep doing the work. We then try to impact the 2020 election and then keep going towards running again. And so she kept going. And we did defeat Trump in Georgia, and we did flip those Senate seats, and that, she's very much in the mix to actually take that gubernatorial election. So Florida's a similar problem. You have to see the benchmarks that we're making the progress and then continue to move forward. You can't just say, oh, well, we didn't win. But if you get 100 votes one year and 200 votes the next year, you can't just say I'm not winning. That's progress, and you have to build upon that.
I appreciate that a lot also because I think through this conversation, I can even almost visually feel the shift going from these one-on-one conversations where I have to, those people on social media who are like, what do you mean? They were just taking a walk in the Capitol. They're fine. Or the people who sort of really are saying, well, there's so many more votes on the Democratic side. There must be fraud. There's no way this many people have turned out. Instead of engaging in that level, we can sort of pull it back up to this huge civic engagement level and really get involved in the process of making change as opposed to really in this minutia of one-on-one battles with people, which really just serves to destroy the psychology and the relationships we can potentially have with people.
Right. And all gets to what kind of society do we want? Do we believe this is a democracy and should be a democracy? And if it's a democracy, shouldn't everybody participate? And I had even had to challenge myself to kind of like writing these different prescriptions for change or what things could be. And then so I actually wanted to putting in the book talking about like Peru as mandatory voting. And the part, even myself, was kind of like, well, that's a little radical. But I was like, we have mandatory taxes, right? We think that's an important thing for everybody to do, so we require you to do it. So if that's a valuable social function, shouldn't we require everybody to vote? Isn't that also so? But we don't proceed from the standpoint that we want everybody to vote, and we're letting the rights views around voter fraud and stopping people from voting have more saliency and currency than it deserves. The starting point should be, do we want everybody to vote? And if so, how do we go about doing that? And so that's, I think, also how we can start to change the conversation and reframe it in ways that will lead towards longer benefits.
Do you think, speaking of the long game and answering and addressing questions like that, I think it's very clear when we talked about the Republican and the right-wing view about the long game that they have and maintaining white supremacy. Do you feel like there is enough of at this point, in our country, we have two major political parties. There's not been a really viable third party option that has crept up yet. But so then on the Democrat side, do you think there is enough of a long game? Do you think there's enough of a clear what do we want as opposed to what do we not want at this stage?
No, there's not a long game on what we want, and there's not a long game around how we get there and how the two interrelate. And so, again, back to Stacey, who's the preeminent leader. She wrote a long piece in the New York Times called How to Turn Your Red State Blue. And she says in there, it may take 10 years, do it anyways. And so she lays out this basic prescription: increasing voter participation, civic engagement, et cetera. But that's not how most political money gets spent. That's not how the biggest Democratic and progressive donors think. It's still a lot about television ads and trying to find whatever clever, innovation they can do rather than the nitty-gritty work of building organizations that are community-based and do the work to turn people out to get them to vote. That's not the standard operating procedure. That's not how the vast majority of the actually billions of dollars that get spent. So there's that. And then there's the interplay of that reality with how the public policy agenda unfolds. And then are you pursuing a public policy agenda that speaks to and inspires and mobilizes the growing new majority electorate? Majority of people under 18 are people of color. And so what's the public policy? So I was quite pleasantly surprised to see both the decision and the background of the decision around the student debt relief piece, that the White House ultimately did decide to lean into that and lean into it more heavily because they wanted to send a message to young people and people of color that they were actually acting on their behalf. So that's an example of the intersection of public policy and political change, but it's not the driving force. It's still far too, short term, next election, what's the tactical buzzword you can say, rather than building this longer term piece. So that remains one of the biggest challenges that we face. And so that's why I wrote a book, to try to point a different paths.
I appreciate that. What else have we not talked about or not asked about that you think is important to share?
I think that just maybe to lean further in this piece about the backing the leaders and the level 5 leaders, and then a multiplicity of ways that can be done. And so people need, it's almost like, I think people should think about, even in their local area or some of the folks that we mentioned, it's almost like can you kind of, I don't know if adopt is the right word, but sponsor this type of a person and kind of be their backer, track their work, share their work, get on their mailing list, share their work with your networks. And then to the extent, one is able, can you check in on them? Like, how are these folks doing in terms of, are we making sure that their totality of experiences, able to take vacations and tend to their families and get rested so that they can stay in the game for the long term. So it's, I think, finding people and then really digging in to back them in a multiplicity of ways over the long term. That, I think, is a very critical role that's necessary for everybody to play.
Yes. All right. If people want to find you, find your work, find your book, where can they go?
democracyincolor.com. That's the organization. We do our podcast every 2 weeks. We do a weekly newsletter that I write and our team puts together in terms of articles and information. And so you can sign up for that news, get on our mailing list at democracyincolor.com and stay in the loop.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.